Liberia's rescue mission, Off the Rails, a critical analysis of Unity Party's governance under President Boakai. Welcome to the Bold African Voice, BAV, where we speak truth to power and amplify Africa's untold stories. I'm Abdul Karim Kargbo, born and raised in Africa. Today, we turn our lens on Liberia, where President Boakai's much-hyped rescue mission appears to be losing traction. 18 months after taking office, are we seeing transformation or stagnation? Is Liberia on the brink of revival or retreating into familiar cycles of disillusionment? Join us for a deep, data-driven, and Pan-African breakdown of where things stand and where they must go. This isn't just about Liberia, it's about Africa's future. Stay tuned. 18 months into the presidency of Joseph Boakai, Liberia finds itself at a political and socio-economic crossroads. The Unity Party, UP, having ascended to power in 2024 on a wave of high expectations, now faces mounting scrutiny over its performance. One of the sharpest critiques has come from former Vice President Jewel Howard Taylor, who during her appearance on Spoon Talk on April 6, 2025, stated candidly that the much-touted rescue mission has slipped the wagon. The promise of rescue versus the reality of governance. When President Boakai defeated incumbent George Weah in a closely contested election with a narrow margin of just 17,000 votes, many Liberians believed change was imminent. The campaign promise of national rejuvenation under the slogan of Rescuing Liberia resonated with a population worn down by years of underperformance in key governance sectors. However, as Howard Taylor remarked, it is not as easy to fix it or bring to pass all of those promises. This sobering admission underscores a widespread perception that governance in Liberia remains plagued by institutional inertia, fragile infrastructure, and a weak public sector. Despite President Boakai's extensive experience, including his tenure as vice president under Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the challenges remain enormous. Liberia continues to struggle with what Howard Taylor rightly identifies as the basics: food, clothing, and shelter. According to the World Bank, more than 50% of Liberians still live below the poverty line, and food insecurity affects nearly a third of the population, a fractured electorate and a divided mandate. Howard Taylor's analysis that the CDC lost minimally suggests a deeply divided political landscape. A nation nearly split in half, 51% for Boakai's UP and 49% for Weah's CDC, suggests not only a fragile mandate, but also a volatile public mood. In comparative terms, Liberia mirrors the political polarization seen in other African democracies, such as Kenya and Nigeria, where electoral margins have been thin and opposition grievances often linger long after the results are announced. Such divisions call for a leadership style that is unifying, not polarizing. President Boakai's administration must actively engage with opposition voices and civil society to bridge these divides, lest it risk governing in a vacuum of diminishing public trust. From First Lady to former Vice President, Howard Taylor's personal struggles. In what can only be described as a shocking indictment of the treatment of former office holders in Liberia, Jewel Howard Taylor also revealed personal struggles that raise critical questions about Liberia's institutional respect for public service. She claims she has not received statutory benefits due to her as a former vice president. No half salary, no official vehicles, no security detail. Worse still, she described an almost humiliating moment during the transition when she was left without transportation after the inauguration, forced to wait under a tree for 45 minutes before a private vehicle rescued her. Her experience mirrors broader issues in African states where political transitions are often not just administratively chaotic, but vengeful. In Sierra Leone, for example, opposition members and former officials have complained of targeted audits, confiscations, and dismissals what critics describe as winner-takes-all governance. Meanwhile, in Malawi, former President Peter Mutharika's security details were abruptly withdrawn following his electoral defeat in 2020. These recurring trends point to a lack of maturity in democratic transitions across the continent. Communication breakdown, a CDC regret, and a cautionary tale. Interestingly, Howard Taylor also acknowledged shortcomings in her own administration under President Weah, noting, "We did not do well in transmitting what was happening in our government for the people to see." This comment sheds light on a chronic issue in African governance, the failure to communicate effectively with the citizenry. Public information mechanisms in Liberia, like in many African countries, are weak, often partisan, and heavily politicized. This communication vacuum can become fertile ground for misinformation, discontent, and opposition mobilization. Boakai's government should take this as a lesson. Without consistent and transparent engagement with the public, even the most well-intentioned reforms will be lost in translation. Countries like Ghana and Rwanda have made strides in leveraging both traditional and digital media to build public trust and explain policies. Liberia could do the same by strengthening the role of the Ministry of Information and supporting independent media platforms. The regional view, Liberia in the African mirror. From a regional standpoint, Liberia's experience is not unique. Across West Africa, countries like Senegal, Guinea, and Nigeria have faced similar struggles balancing democratic expectations with governance delivery. In Senegal, President Macky Sall's administration was recently tested by mass protests over youth unemployment and concerns about democratic backsliding. Guinea is still reeling from the aftermath of Alpha Conde's third-term bid and subsequent military coup. In Nigeria, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu has faced early backlash for subsidy removals and rising living costs, despite winning with a relatively slim mandate. These examples illustrate that a thin electoral victory, if not managed inclusively and transparently, can quickly turn into political unrest. Liberia, still recovering from decades of civil war, must tread carefully. President Boakai's reform agenda, stuck in the pipeline or slowly gaining momentum. When Joseph Boakai assumed office in January 2024, he promised to root out corruption, restore confidence in public institutions, and attract foreign investment. However, the reform agenda has struggled to gain traction in the face of entrenched bureaucracy, political infighting, and limited fiscal space. Critics say there's been more rhetoric than reform, while allies argue that the president is methodically laying the groundwork for sustainable change. One key area of focus has been the civil service. President Boakai's administration has emphasized restructuring bloated payrolls and weeding out ghost workers, an initiative supported by international partners such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. But implementation has been slow. The Civil Service Agency, CSA, has yet to present a full audit of government workers, raising doubts about the seriousness of this effort. Furthermore, judicial independence remains under question. Although the Boakai government has publicly committed to strengthening the judiciary, several corruption-related investigations involving former officials have either stalled or been perceived as politically selective. This perceived weaponization of anti-corruption measures risks eroding public trust and mirroring the same political score-settling behavior that undermined previous administrations. Liberia's economic health check, fragile gains, mounting pressures. Economically, Liberia is walking a tightrope. The country remains heavily dependent on foreign aid and extractive industries, especially rubber, iron ore, and gold, which leaves it vulnerable to commodity price shocks. In its April 2025 Regional Economic Outlook, the IMF warned that growth across fragile states in sub-Saharan Africa, including Liberia, remains uneven and insufficient to reduce poverty meaningfully. Liberia's projected growth for 2025 is around 3.7%, down from the 4.5% forecast in early 2024. Inflation remains high, hovering around 13%, and the local currency, Liberian dollar, has steadily depreciated against the US dollar. This has significantly weakened purchasing power, with basic staples like rice and oil becoming increasingly unaffordable for the average Liberian. Unemployment and underemployment, especially among the youth, are fueling despair and sporadic protests. To counter these challenges, the Boakai administration has initiated dialogue with private investors and multilateral agencies. However, the pace of investment remains sluggish due to lingering concerns about corruption, land rights disputes, and an unreliable legal framework. According to the African Development Bank's 2024 Liberia Country Report, a lack of clear regulatory frameworks continues to deter foreign direct investment in sectors like agriculture, tourism, and infrastructure. Governance and institutional reforms, a work in progress or a stalled revolution. Institutional reform has been a consistent demand from civil society organizations, and the Unity Party had promised an overhaul of Liberia's weak governance structures. Some symbolic moves have been made, such as publicly declaring assets by select ministers, but critics say these gestures are not systemic and lack legal backing. The much anticipated Local Government Act, intended to decentralize governance and empower rural communities, has stalled in the legislature. Rural citizens, particularly in counties like Lofa, Grand Cru, and Sinoe, feel increasingly marginalized in national decision making. This feeds into a broader narrative of Monrovia-centric governance that has plagued Liberia for decades. A comparison with Ghana's decentralization drive under the Local Government Service Act, Act 656, reveals the missed opportunity. Ghana's system allows district chief executives, DCEs, to manage development at the grassroots level with budgetary support and accountability mechanisms. Liberia's decentralization remains largely theoretical, hampered by limited political will and fiscal constraints. The National Elections Commission, NEC, another cornerstone institution, is under pressure to reform. In the 2023 election cycle, the NEC faced allegations of logistical mismanagement, delayed result transmission, and limited transparency. Electoral integrity remains a sensitive issue, especially with a polarized electorate, and suspicions of vote manipulation still fresh in public memory. Looking to the continent, what can Liberia learn from Rwanda, Ghana, and Botswana? Liberia's path to development can benefit from looking at African countries that have combined democratic governance with economic transformation. Take Rwanda. Under President Paul Kagame, the country has made significant strides in infrastructure, public health, and digital governance. Though not without criticism for human rights concerns, Rwanda ranks among the least corrupt countries in Africa, according to Transparency International's 2024 Corruption Perceptions Index. In Ghana, regular political transitions have not disrupted policy continuity, particularly in education and digitization. The country's Ghana card system has drastically improved public service delivery and reduced fraud. Similarly, Botswana continues to shine as a beacon of stability with sound macroeconomic management and a strong rule of law. Liberia's challenge is not one of knowledge or resources alone. It is the lack of political discipline, weak institutions, and fragmented national identity. As Jewel Howard Taylor's observations underline, unless governance becomes people-centered and inclusive, Liberia risks returning to cycles of disappointment and unrest. Opposition and civil society, partners in governance or political bystanders. In any healthy democracy, the opposition and civil society serve as critical watchdogs and contributors to national discourse. In Liberia's case, however, The relationship between the Unity Party-led government and opposition forces has been marked by mutual suspicion and limited engagement. Former Vice President Jewel Howard Taylor's reflections suggest a deepening rift, with lingering tensions from the tight 2024 election still influencing political behavior. While President Boakai pledged an inclusive government, tangible efforts to incorporate opposition viewpoints into policy discussions or decision-making processes remain minimal. The Coalition for Democratic Change, CDC, led by former President George Weah, has complained of political exclusion and vendetta-style governance, pointing to investigations and audits disproportionately targeting their members. Civil society groups have also reported declining access to public information and increasing bureaucratic bottlenecks. According to the Center for Transparency and Accountability in Liberia, CENTAL, there's been a reduction in public consultations on critical national issues. These developments risk shrinking the civic space, undermining Liberia's fragile democratic gains since the end of the Civil War. For comparison, South Africa's post-apartheid governance model, despite its flaws, maintains institutionalized opposition roles within parliamentary committees, allowing the Democratic Alliance, DA, and other parties to contribute constructively. Similarly, Kenya's Building Bridges Initiative, BBI, though ultimately struck down, demonstrated an attempt to create an inclusive governance framework. Liberia could benefit from such models of structured political inclusion. Youth and gender representation, a forgotten constituency. Liberia is a country where over 60% of the population is under the age of 35. Yet youth inclusion in governance remains a persistent challenge. While the Unity Party has appointed some younger ministers and advisors, many young Liberians remain unemployed, underrepresented, and disillusioned. Jewel Howard Taylor's comments indirectly touch on this frustration. The government has yet to address the basics for ordinary people. For many young Liberians, these basics include access to vocational training, entrepreneurship support, internet connectivity, and meaningful political participation. Youth-led movements, like Concerned Youth for Democratic Governance and the Car We Deserve Better, have staged peaceful protests demanding reforms, but with limited response from the executive. Gender representation is similarly uneven. Despite Liberia's historic achievement of electing Africa's first female president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, women continue to be sidelined in decision-making roles. Jewel Howard Taylor remains one of the few prominent female voices in Liberian politics. Her recent public lament about her treatment as a former vice president reveals both gender disrespect and systemic disregard for former officials. Liberia signed onto the African Union's Maputo Protocol, which calls for at least 30% representation of women in political and public decision-making. Yet in 2025, only 11% of Liberian lawmakers are women. By contrast, countries like Ethiopia, Senegal, and Namibia have crossed or neared the 40% threshold in recent years, with proactive gender quotas and political will. Media freedom and public perception, navigating a shifting terrain. One of the more worrying signs under the Unity Party's rule has been the growing concern about media freedom and public transparency. While Liberia's press remains among the freest in West Africa, according to Reporters Without Borders, recent reports of intimidation, online harassment, and reduced press access to state functions are eroding those freedoms. A leaked memo from a journalist at Front Page Africa cited administrative restrictions placed on media personnel covering the executive mansion. Similarly, community radio stations in rural counties have complained of arbitrary license reviews and selective enforcement by the Liberia Telecommunications Authority, LTA, measures critics say are politically motivated. This is a significant departure from the promises of openness that characterized the Boakai campaign. The administration must remember that a free press is not only a constitutional right, but also an essential tool for accountability and public trust. Public perception, meanwhile, is shifting. According to a March 2025 Afrobarometer survey, 56% of Liberians believe the country is headed in the wrong direction, up from 39% in early 2024. Trust in the presidency has dropped from 68% in the early months of Boakai's administration to just 41%. These numbers reflect growing frustration with the pace of change and unmet expectations. Regional diplomacy and security posture, Liberia's role in the Mono River and beyond its borders, Liberia's role in the Mono River Union, MRU, and ECOWAS has grown increasingly vital, especially given regional instability. With coups in neighboring Guinea and Mali, and political turbulence in Sierra Leone and Burkina Faso, Liberia's democratic survival matters not just for its people, but for West Africa as a whole. Under Boakai, Liberia has pledged support for ECOWAS efforts to restore democratic order in Niger and Guinea. However, Liberia's own house must be in order to serve as a credible regional voice. Domestic political tension, electoral grievances, and human rights concerns weaken the moral high ground Liberia could otherwise command in regional diplomacy. Boakai's participation in the 2025 ECOWAS Heads of State Summit in Abuja was notable, especially his call for a joint West African anti-corruption task force. But such ambitions must be backed by action at home. The credibility gap between regional advocacy and domestic performance is a liability that could weaken Liberia's influence. Natural resource governance. Are Liberia's riches serving its people? Liberia's abundance of natural resources, rubber, iron ore, gold, diamonds, timber, has historically been a double-edged sword. While these commodities should serve as levers for economic transformation, they've often been sources of exploitation, corruption, and conflict. The Boakai administration inherited a sector plagued by outdated contracts, revenue leakages, and opaque operations. 18 months in, however, little has been done to significantly restructure the industry. The government's 2024 campaign emphasized resource justice and vowed to renegotiate contracts that did not serve the national interest. Yet, to date, major concessions signed during the Way administration, particularly with foreign mining firms in Bong, Nimba, and Grand Cape Mount, remain intact, despite growing protests from affected communities. In March 2025, citizens in Bomi County staged a sit-in at the headquarters of a multinational gold mining company, citing land degradation, pollution of water sources, and failure to fulfill corporate social responsibility (CSR) agreements. Similar grievances were echoed by residents of Margibi and Lofa, where rubber plantations have expanded without adequate compensation or employment guarantees. Comparatively, countries like Botswana and Namibia have demonstrated that good governance in natural resource management is possible. Botswana's diamond industry is jointly owned by the government and De Beers, with clear transparency mechanisms and community benefit schemes. Liberia could learn from such models by strengthening the Liberia Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, LEET, and ensuring public access to all contracts and environmental assessments. A progressive step would be the domestication of the Africa Mining Vision, AMV, an African Union initiative that promotes resource-based development strategies. Liberia's full implementation of this vision could empower communities, reduce illicit financial flows, and generate sustainable revenue for national development. Health and education, still in critical condition? Liberia's public health system remains underfunded and overstretched. Though the country made international headlines during the Ebola outbreak of 2014-2016, structural weaknesses persist nearly a decade later. The Boakai administration has promised increased health sector funding, but the 2025 national budget allocates less than 8% to health, far below the Abuja Declaration target of 15% for African nations. According to the Liberia Medical and Dental Association, rural clinics still face chronic shortages of basic supplies and qualified personnel. Maternal and infant mortality rates remain alarmingly high, particularly in southeastern counties. Meanwhile, under 5 stunting due to malnutrition continues to hover above 30%, one of the highest rates in West Africa. The education sector is in no better shape. While the government has made school enrollment free in public institutions, quality and accessibility are still major concerns. Teacher absenteeism, lack of textbooks, overcrowded classrooms, and the rising cost of private tutoring have widened the gap between rural and urban students. A February 2025 report by UNICEF Liberia revealed that 1 in 4 Liberian children of school-going age is out of school, especially girls in remote communities. Additionally, allegations of transactional sex for grades, referred to locally as sexually transmitted grades, remain widespread in secondary and tertiary institutions. Rwanda's investment in school feeding programs, Ghana's free senior high school policy, and Ethiopia's community health extension program are tangible examples Liberia could explore. Without bold reforms and targeted investment in human capital, the country's long-term development will remain elusive. The 2029 horizon, survival politics or strategic statecraft. As political observers begin to speculate about the 2029 election cycle, questions abound regarding the Unity Party's strategy moving forward. Will Boakai's team focus on laying down institutional reforms and rebuilding public trust, or will it prioritize short-term political survival through patronage and populist gestures? Rumors are already circulating about internal rifts within the ruling party and succession battles among younger political aspirants. While Boakai has not publicly declared whether he intends to seek re-election, he would be 84 by the next polls. Analysts believe the upcoming midterm political reshuffling will be a critical indicator of the administration's trajectory. For now, the Unity Party faces a dilemma: remain stuck in bureaucratic inertia or adopt a bold, reformist stance that might upset entrenched interests but deliver long-term gains. The latter could win over disillusioned youth and civil society. The former risks emboldening a revitalized opposition, especially if the CDC regroups with new leadership and a clearer message. Diaspora engagement and the remittance economy, untapped potential or dependency trap. Liberia's diaspora plays a pivotal role in the economy, contributing over $400 million annually in remittances, according to the Central Bank of Liberia's 2024 report. These funds exceed foreign direct investment and official development assistance, making remittances the lifeline for many households. Yet, the government has failed to strategically integrate the diaspora into national development. There are no clear policies on diaspora investment incentives, dual citizenship engagement, or property protection mechanisms. Frustrations abound among Liberians abroad, who face bureaucratic red tape, land ownership disputes, and skepticism from officials when attempting to invest. The Ghana Diaspora Engagement Policy, launched in 2020, provides a useful framework. It includes a diaspora investment fund, tax incentives, and diaspora bonds, all tools Liberia could replicate. Nigeria, similarly, has leveraged its global diaspora through the Nigerian in Diaspora Commission, NIDCOM, to facilitate skills transfer and investment. Without a structured engagement strategy, Liberia risks turning its diaspora into perpetual donors rather than co-creators of national prosperity. Liberia's digital future and infrastructure challenges, laying the foundation or missing the wave. As global economies shift toward digitization, Liberia finds itself at a crossroads between technological opportunity and infrastructural neglect. President Boakai's government has made public commitments to modernize public services and increase digital inclusion, But 18 months into his administration, the pace of transformation remains slow and uneven. The Ministry of Posts and Telecommunications, alongside the Liberia Telecommunications Authority, LTA, announced a national digital strategy in early 2024 aimed at expanding broadband access, e-governance platforms, and digital literacy. However, internet penetration remains below 25%, and access is heavily concentrated in Monrovia and a few urban centers, leaving rural counties digitally excluded. Power supply remains the biggest obstacle. Despite the partial revival of the Mount Coffee hydropower plant, blackouts are still frequent, and Liberia ranks among the lowest in energy access across West Africa. According to Power Africa, only 27% of the population has reliable electricity. The Liberia Electricity Corporation, LEC, continues to struggle with technical losses, theft, and financial mismanagement. Without reliable electricity and internet connectivity, initiatives like digital taxation systems, biometric voter registration, or online business registration will remain out of reach. This gap widens Liberia's competitiveness gap in the ECOWAS subregion. Comparatively, Senegal and Kenya have rapidly expanded digital access by investing in public-private partnerships. Senegal's Smart Senegal initiative and Kenya's Ajira digital program have empowered youth with digital skills and created platforms for e-learning, e-commerce, and innovation. Liberia's youthful population, if given the infrastructure, can become a powerful force in the digital economy. Public sector reform and anti-corruption drive. Genuine commitment or political symbolism. Anti-corruption rhetoric has been central to President Boakai's governance narrative. But Liberians are asking, where is the action? While institutions like the Liberia Anti-Corruption Commission, LACC, and the General Auditing Commission, GAC, have been vocal under this administration, their impact remains limited by legal constraints and political interference. The LACC's 2024 annual report revealed that while over 200 corruption-related complaints were received, less than 5% advanced to prosecution. Moreover, the hasty dismissal of key anti-corruption investigators in late 2024 raised alarms among international observers, including the U.S. Embassy in Monrovia, which issued a statement calling for institutional independence and non-political interference in anti-corruption efforts. There is still no comprehensive asset recovery framework, and asset declarations by government officials, although made voluntarily by a few, are not mandated or verified by an independent body. In contrast, countries like Sierra Leone under the Bio administration enacted a special anti-corruption division within the judiciary, which accelerated trials and ensured recoveries of stolen public funds, albeit not without criticism over political bias. If Liberia is to regain public trust, President Boakai must prioritize legal reforms that shield anti-corruption agencies from executive influence, provide them with prosecutorial powers, and ensure whistleblower protection, currently lacking despite repeated promises. Customary governance and the role of traditional leaders, partners or political pawns. Liberia's dual governance system, formal state structures coexisting with traditional authorities, remains a defining feature of its post-war political landscape. Chiefs, clan heads, and paramount rulers wield enormous influence in local communities, particularly in rural Liberia, where the reach of formal state institutions is weak. President Boakai, like his predecessors, has maintained close ties with the National Traditional Council of Chiefs and Elders, often leveraging their platforms for political mobilization. However, the real potential of traditional leaders, as local peace builders, custodians of justice, and development agents, remains underutilized. Customary courts still handle the majority of civil and minor criminal cases in rural areas. However, these courts operate with little to no oversight, and citizens, especially women, often face discriminatory rulings based on patriarchal interpretations of customary law. A progressive integration model can be seen in South Africa, where the Traditional Leadership and Governance Framework Act formally recognizes traditional councils while also aligning them with democratic principles, human rights, and the national constitution. Liberia must urgently develop a harmonized legal framework to clearly define the roles, rights, and responsibilities of traditional authorities, ensuring they complement, not compete with, state institutions. Climate change and environmental justice, rising threat, diminishing action. Liberia is one of the most climate vulnerable nations in West Africa, with its 350-mile Atlantic coastline at serious risk due to rising sea levels. Monrovia's West Point community, densely populated and precariously located, faces annual flooding, displacements, and sanitation crises, threats that are only intensifying due to climate change. Despite the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and Liberia's ratification of international climate agreements such as the Paris Accord, domestic policy remains reactive rather than preventive. Liberia's National Adaptation Plan, NAP, developed in partnership with UNDP, has not been fully implemented due to funding gaps and limited interagency coordination. Deforestation is another crisis point. Logging activities, both legal and illegal, have continued at alarming rates, threatening biodiversity and indigenous forest communities. The Forestry Development Authority, FDA, is under-resourced and has struggled to enforce logging moratoriums or prosecute violators. In contrast, Gabon and Rwanda have become continental leaders in sustainable forest management and green economy planning, attracting international carbon financing and private investment. Liberia, with its vast forest reserves, is a prime candidate for such partnerships, if governance, monitoring, and accountability improve. Liberia's international partnerships and donor dynamics, dependency, or strategic collaboration. Liberia has long been dependent on international partners for budgetary support, humanitarian aid, and technical assistance. From the post-conflict reconstruction era to the Ebola recovery period, and now into President Boakai's administration, donor engagement has remained a cornerstone of Liberia's development agenda. However, this dependency has also sparked debate about sovereignty, policy ownership, and long-term sustainability. President Boakai's foreign policy has leaned heavily on rebuilding trust with multilateral institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, World Bank, and the United Nations Development Program, UNDP. His government successfully negotiated a 3-year extended credit facility, ECF arrangement, with the IMF in late 2024, unlocking a $250 million loan package aimed at stabilizing macroeconomic conditions and supporting structural reforms. However, these financial agreements come with tough conditionalities: fiscal consolidation, subsidy cuts, and public sector downsizing that often trigger domestic backlash. Already, the Boakai government faces rising discontent over proposed reductions in fuel subsidies and wage restructuring for civil servants. There are also increasing concerns about donor-driven priorities overshadowing national development strategies. For example, critics argue that Liberia's pro-poor agenda for prosperity and development, PAPD, initiated under WE but modified under Boakai, lacks local ownership, as its key pillars align too closely with donor frameworks rather than Liberian realities. In contrast, countries like Ethiopia and Morocco have developed homegrown development blueprints with clear national goals, inviting donors to align with their terms rather than dictating them. Liberia must rethink how it negotiates its development partnerships, shifting from passive recipient to equal partner, if it hopes to assert its sovereignty while benefiting from global collaboration. Public service delivery and decentralization, getting closer to the people or recycling old problems. Decentralization has been a recurring theme in Liberian governance reform efforts since the end of the Civil War. The idea is simple but powerful: bring government services closer to the people. Yet, 2 decades later, implementation remains largely cosmetic. The Local Government Act, passed in 2018, was meant to operationalize decentralization through the creation of county service centers, CSCs, devolved budgetary control, and greater community participation. However, most CSCs are underfunded, poorly staffed, and lack the autonomy to deliver services effectively. In 2025, citizens in River G, Grand Gade, and Gbarpolu counties still have to travel to Monrovia for basic documentation like birth certificates or business registration. President Boakai, while supportive of decentralization in speeches, has yet to enact any major reform to accelerate the process. Budget allocations to county governments remain symbolic, and county development funds are frequently delayed or misappropriated. A model worth studying is Uganda's decentralization framework, which, despite its own challenges, has given real planning and financial powers to district governments. Liberia's decentralization effort must be backed by political will, constitutional reform, and sustained financial commitment to build trust in local governance structures, rebuilding national identity in a divided society, beyond political party lines. Jewel, Howard Taylor's remarks on Liberia being deeply divided post 2024 elections are not just political rhetoric, they reflect a real and growing sentiment among Liberians. Ethnic affiliations, regional loyalties, and partisan identities continue to overshadow national unity. The narrow margin of victory in the last election only emphasized the country's political fragmentation. The task of rebuilding national cohesion is immense. It requires more than slogans. It demands inclusive governance, representation, healing of historical grievances, and promotion of a shared national vision. The current government's approach, however, has leaned more toward consolidating party structures than building cross party alliances or national reconciliation programs. South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, post apartheid, although not without criticism, offered a platform for dialogue, historical accountability, and restorative justice. Liberia's own TRC recommendations, dating back to 2009, remain largely unimplemented. Issues such as wartime reparations, memorialization, and accountability for past atrocities have been politically sensitive, but continuing to ignore them only deepens generational wounds. Additionally, there is a growing call for the inclusion of civic education in the school curriculum and public discourse. A stronger sense of citizenship and national pride, especially among youth, can help transcend the ethnic and party lines that often define political behavior. Civic engagement, electoral preparedness, and youth political awakening. Liberia's new frontier. With the next general election still 4 years away, political activity is already beginning to stir. Civic groups, youth organizations, and opposition parties are mobilizing around themes of accountability, service delivery, and transparency. The 2023 elections saw an unprecedented level of youth engagement on social media, radio call in programs, and street campaigns, a trend that appears to be continuing. However, this civic awakening must be nurtured through institutional support. The National Elections Commission, NEC, must begin early preparations to rebuild public confidence after the 2023 contest was marred by allegations of irregularities and logistical chaos. Voter registration reform, the use of technology in vote tallying, and the independence of the NEC will be critical to safeguarding future elections. Moreover, youth engagement should go beyond election cycles. Mechanisms such as youth parliaments, policy debates, and participatory budgeting can offer young people a more sustained role in governance. In Nigeria, for example, the Not Too Young to Run law has opened the political space for youth candidacy. Liberia's political parties must similarly be challenged to open up internal leadership structures to young aspirants. Liberia's cultural revival and the creative economy, a sleeping giant awakens. Liberia's rich cultural heritage, rooted in diverse ethnic traditions, historical narratives, music, storytelling, dance, and artistic expression, remains an underutilized asset in the country's development matrix. As the world increasingly recognizes the economic power of the creative industries, many African nations are harnessing their cultural capital not only for national pride, but also for revenue generation, youth employment, and global influence. Unfortunately, Liberia has not yet fully tapped into this potential. The creative economy remains largely informal, underfunded, and unsupported by state policy. The Ministry of Information, Cultural Affairs, and Tourism, MICAT, continues to receive one of the smallest budget allocations, and there is no comprehensive national policy guiding investment in arts, culture, or creative entrepreneurship. Yet, the talent exists, from the emerging Afrobeats artists of Monrovia to traditional dancers in Nimba and visual artists in Buchanan. Liberia's youth are increasingly turning to creativity as a means of expression and livelihood. The success of platforms like Liberian Music Awards and independent film productions such as Brown Girl Woke demonstrates both the passion and potential of the sector. Lessons abound across Africa. Nigeria's Nollywood, Senegal's fashion industry, South Africa's music scene, and Ghana's Year of Return campaign have all translated cultural identity into economic value. Liberia can draw inspiration from these examples by creating a creative industries development fund, establishing cultural hubs and recording studios in each county, incentivizing digital platforms that promote local content, including arts education in national curricula. President Boakai's administration has an opportunity to not only preserve Liberia's cultural identity, but also transform it into a vibrant economic engine if the will and policy alignment exist. Diaspora diplomacy, brain drain, and brain gain, reversing the tide. The issue of brain drain remains one of Liberia's most pressing and under-discussed development challenges. Over the past 2 decades, thousands of skilled Liberians, nurses, doctors, engineers, academics, have emigrated in search of better opportunities, primarily to the United States, Canada, Europe, and parts of West Africa. This migration, while contributing to significant remittances, over $400 million annually, according to the central bank, has also weakened domestic capacity across critical sectors. Hospitals struggle to retain qualified personnel, universities suffer from a shortage of professors, and government agencies remain understaffed or reliant on technical assistance from foreign consultants. The Boakai administration has yet to develop a formal diaspora engagement strategy beyond symbolic appointments and ad hoc visits. There is no unified database of skilled Liberians abroad, no incentive framework to encourage their return, and no protection policies to guarantee reintegration. By contrast, Rwanda and Ghana have launched successful diaspora return campaigns. Ghana's Diaspora Affairs Office at the Presidency and Rwanda's Ministry of Diaspora Affairs coordinate returnees, facilitate job placement, and promote knowledge transfer programs. Liberia could follow suit by launching a national brain gain initiative, creating returnee grants for Liberians willing to relocate and work in rural communities, offering dual citizenship options and voting rights for Liberians in the diaspora, building diaspora-backed investment schemes for infrastructure and education. Liberia's diaspora is not just a source of remittance, it is a reservoir of knowledge, influence, and innovation. Harnessing this potential requires deliberate policies, mutual trust, and a strong coordination platform. Infrastructure development, roads, housing, and urban planning, still a long road. Ahead, infrastructure remains one of the biggest bottlenecks to Liberia's national development and regional integration. Poor roads, inadequate housing, and chaotic urban planning continue to stifle economic activity, limit mobility, and erode quality of life. President Boakai's administration inherited a long list of incomplete road projects, most notably the Gabarnga Lofa Road, Robertsport Highway, and the deteriorating Elwa RIA Highway linking Monrovia to the international airport. 18 months into his presidency, progress has been slow. The Ministry of Public Works blames limited budgetary support and poor contractor performance, while citizens complain of being cut off during rainy seasons. Housing is another silent crisis. Monrovia faces growing slum expansion, with communities like West Point, New Crewtown, and Peace Island grappling with overcrowding, poor sanitation, and structural vulnerability to sea erosion and flooding. Yet, there has been no national housing policy or public private partnership framework to address affordable housing for low income earners. Urban planning remains largely reactive. Land disputes, unregulated construction, and weak enforcement of zoning laws have made cities unsafe and unsustainable. The Monrovia City Corporation, MCC, and Painesville City Corporation, PCC, continue to operate without long-term development blueprints. In comparison, Ethiopia's Integrated Housing Development Program has built thousands of low-cost units, while Rwanda's Kigali City Master Plan has transformed the urban landscape through smart city planning and green infrastructure. Liberia must act now or risk allowing its urban crisis to spiral further. Recommendations include adopting a national infrastructure master plan with phased priorities, establishing a Liberia Infrastructure Fund supported by diaspora bonds and concessional loans, strengthening the Public Procurement and Concessions Commission, PPCC, to ensure transparent and competitive contracting, creating climate resilient housing policies for coastal and flood prone communities. Liberia and the African Continental Free Trade Area, FCFTA, ready or left behind. Liberia ratified the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA agreement in 2021, committing itself to a new era of intra-African trade and economic integration. But 3 years later, the country remains largely unprepared to take advantage of this historic opportunity. Liberia's production base is weak, its transportation and logistics systems are underdeveloped, and its regulatory environment is not yet aligned with AfCFTA protocols. The Port of Monrovia, for example, still faces customs delays, high handling costs, and bureaucratic bottlenecks, making it uncompetitive compared to ports in Abidjan and Tema. Small and medium enterprises, SMEs, which make up the bulk of Liberia's economy, have not been sensitized or supported to participate in cross-border trade. Meanwhile, other ECOWAS members, such as Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, and Nigeria, are already positioning their businesses and value chains to benefit from tariff-free access to African markets. Liberia needs to urgently establish a national AfCFTA implementation committee, invest in trade facilitation infrastructure, including modern custom systems, offer training and credit facilities to SMEs looking to export, strengthen regional road and rail linkages with neighboring countries. With the right investments and coordination, Liberia can become a gateway between West Africa's economic giants and Central Africa's emerging markets. But that will require bold vision, sound policy, and a strong private sector. The Unity Party's internal dynamics and the question of succession, cohesion, or cracks beneath the surface. As President Joseph Boakai approaches the midpoint of his term, political observers are increasingly focused on the internal dynamics of the Unity Party, UP. While the administration presents a unified front in public, multiple reports from within government and party circles suggest growing tensions, competing ambitions, and early maneuvering for post Boakai leadership. At 80 years old, Boakai is among Africa's oldest serving heads of state. Although he has not declared whether he will seek re election in 2029, many within the Unity Party are already positioning themselves as potential successors. This has quietly triggered factionalism between traditional party loyalists, young technocrats, and regional power brokers, each seeking to define the next phase of UP's identity. Key figures such as Minister of State Nathaniel McGill, Finance Minister Samora Wolokoli, and Senator Prince Moy are frequently mentioned in succession discussions, though none have formally expressed interest. Tensions are particularly acute between older figures who see themselves as guardians of the UP legacy and younger actors advocating for generational change. The risk for the Boakai administration is that these internal rivalries may begin to affect governance, policymaking, and coordination. The Unity Party's Women's League and Youth League, historically influential structures within the party, have also expressed concern about being sidelined in key decision-making processes. Comparatively, succession planning has destabilized many ruling parties across Africa. In Tanzania, internal competition between factions under CCM created sharp tensions during the transition from President Magufuli to President Samia Suluhu. In Uganda, long-standing succession uncertainty around President Museveni continues to paralyze both the ruling NRM and the opposition. For Liberia, proactive leadership transition planning within the UP could strengthen internal democracy and ensure party unity beyond the Boakai era. A transparent primary process, strong ideological cohesion, and generational inclusion will be key to sustaining public trust. Faith-based institutions and moral leadership, still the nation's conscience? Liberia has long been a deeply religious society, with churches and mosques serving not just as places of worship, but also as community hubs, peace builders, and moral compasses. During the Civil War and in the post-conflict Reconstruction era, faith-based institutions played critical roles in humanitarian aid, reconciliation, and civic education. Today, however, their influence in national policy and political accountability appears to be waning. Many citizens express concern that religious leaders have grown too cozy with political elites, often refraining from speaking out against corruption, injustice, and government excesses. President Boakai, a Methodist by faith, enjoys strong ties with major Christian denominations, particularly the Liberia Council of Churches, LCC. However, his administration has yet to leverage this moral partnership to drive civic renewal or ethical governance. Similarly, the National Muslim Council of Liberia, a key voice in the Islamic community, has largely focused on religious affairs rather than broader socio-political engagement. Faith-based organizations could be powerful partners in pushing for national reconciliation and conflict prevention, civic education and voter awareness, peaceful interreligious coexistence in increasingly diverse communities, social services in areas where the state is absent, such as health and education. Models of such engagement are evident in Kenya, where the Interreligious Council plays a visible role in elections and national cohesion. Liberia's faith sector must reclaim its moral leadership role by holding government accountable while also guiding communities toward unity and integrity. Security sector reform and civil-military relations, fragile stability or strengthening foundation. Nearly 2 decades after the end of Liberia's brutal civil conflict, the country's security apparatus remains in transition. While the military and police have undergone substantial reforms, with international support from the United Nations Mission in Liberia, UNMIL, and ECOWAS, challenges of professionalism, political neutrality, and public trust persist. The Armed Forces of Liberia, AFL, restructured from scratch in the post-war years, is one of the most respected state institutions. However, limited funding, poor logistics, and lack of domestic procurement capabilities hinder its operational effectiveness. The Liberia National Police, LNP, on the other hand, continues to face accusations of brutality, corruption, and lack of responsiveness, particularly in rural areas. Security sector reform under the Boakai administration has been modest. While the government has made commitments to increase personnel and training, there is little evidence of a broader national security strategy that addresses border security and cross-border crime, particularly in the Mano River region, rising urban crime, gang activity, and drug abuse, especially in Monrovia, human trafficking and cybercrime, which have seen increased activity in recent years. Civil-military relations remain stable, but concerns about political interference linger. The deployment of police officers during protests or elections often sparks public debate over impartiality. Liberia must invest in community policing, expand human rights training, and build stronger civilian oversight mechanisms to ensure the security forces are truly serving the people, not politicians. Countries like Ghana and Namibia offer models of civilian-led, professional, and rights-based security governance that Liberia could emulate. The unfinished transitional justice agenda, a nation still waiting for closure. One of Liberia's most painful and unresolved issues is its transitional justice process. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, which completed its work in 2009, recommended dozens of actions, ranging from war crimes prosecutions to reparations, institutional reforms, and memorialization. Yet successive governments, including Boakai's, have failed to implement most of these recommendations. This inaction has deepened the wounds of war victims, many of whom continue to live in poverty, trauma, and neglect. The call for a war and economic crimes court has grown louder, backed by local and international civil society organizations, diaspora activists, and some members of the legislature. However, political resistance remains strong, especially from figures implicated in the TRC report who still hold influential positions. President Boakai has remained non-committal, urging dialogue while deflecting responsibility to the legislature. This avoidance has been criticized as a betrayal of justice and a threat to sustainable peace. Countries like Sierra Leone and Rwanda, despite controversies, implemented transitional justice mechanisms that enabled national healing and restored international credibility. If Liberia is to close this painful chapter and build a future based on truth and accountability, it must revisit the TRC report with political courage, engage victims and survivors in designing a roadmap for justice and reconciliation, collaborate with international partners to establish a hybrid court if needed, invest in memorial sites, trauma healing centers, and civic education on Liberia's conflict history. Press freedom and digital rights in Liberia, expanding civic space or tightening the grip. Liberia, with its vibrant media landscape, has historically been one of the most open environments for press freedom in West Africa. From the days of independent newspapers like Front Page Africa to the proliferation of radio stations and digital platforms, journalists have played a vital role in shaping political discourse, exposing corruption, and holding leaders accountable. However, under the Boakai administration, the atmosphere for media and digital freedom has become increasingly mixed. While the government has not enacted any draconian laws targeting press freedom, there has been a noticeable uptick in subtle restrictions and institutional pressures. Several journalists have reported threats, cyber harassment, and intimidation by security personnel following critical reporting. In early 2025, the arrest of a local blogger for spreading misinformation related to alleged procurement fraud sparked national and international condemnation. Digital rights advocates have also raised concerns over discussions in the legislature to introduce a social media regulation bill, which would criminalize defamatory content shared online. Critics argue the bill is overly broad and could be weaponized to stifle dissent and silence critics, particularly young digital activists who have taken to platforms like Twitter and Facebook to organize, protest, and educate. According to the 2025 Reporters Without Borders (RSF) Global Index, Liberia dropped 8 places due to increasing concerns about self-censorship and delayed access to public information. Journalists complain of government ministries withholding data, delaying responses to media inquiries, or granting selective interviews only to favored outlets. Meanwhile, rural-based community radio stations face growing financial pressure, with some being forced off air due to lack of government support, rising operational costs, or arbitrary licensing reviews. Comparatively, countries like Ghana and Namibia continue to uphold strong constitutional guarantees for press freedom, offering Liberia tangible policy pathways. To restore its reputation and safeguard democratic progress, the Boakai government must strengthen the Freedom of Information (FOI) Commission, repeal or revise outdated criminal libel laws still lingering in statutes, protect journalists from arbitrary arrest and harassment, promote digital literacy and responsible content sharing through civic campaigns rather than repressive legislation. Public health resilience in the post-Ebola and COVID-19 era, a system still on life support. Liberia's public health system has faced some of the world's most traumatic shocks, from the devastating Ebola outbreak, 2014-2016, that claimed over 4,800 lives, to the global COVID-19 pandemic, which exposed the fragility of health infrastructures even in the most advanced nations. While lessons were learned and systems were partially restructured, major gaps remain. The National Public Health Institute of Liberia, NPHL, established in the aftermath of Ebola, was a promising institutional step. It has played a key role in disease surveillance, outbreak response, and health communication. However, years of underfunding, political interference, and capacity drain have slowed its momentum. Most health centers across rural counties are understaffed, poorly equipped, and dependent on external donors like USAID, WHO, and Médecins Sans Frontières. Basic maternal care, vaccination coverage, and emergency response capabilities remain patchy at best. In many regions, citizens still rely on traditional healers or make long treks to county capitals for minor health services. A 2025 survey by the Liberia Health Workers Association revealed that more than 60% of health professionals are dissatisfied with pay, working conditions, and promotion structures, raising fears of a renewed wave of brain drain. Despite President Boakai's pledge to invest in healthcare for every Liberian, the 2025 national budget allocated just 7.2% to the health sector, far below the Abuja Declaration benchmark of 15%. Meanwhile, corruption scandals continue to plague drug procurement, staff recruitment, and donor fund utilization. Liberia could draw inspiration from Ethiopia's health extension program, Rwanda's community-based health insurance scheme, or Ghana's digitized health records and biometric patient systems. Without strategic investment, Liberia's health sector remains dangerously exposed to future crises. Recommendations moving forward include scaling up investment in primary healthcare and mobile clinics, recruiting and retaining local healthcare professionals through incentive programs, investing in health emergency preparedness, especially in border areas, strengthening collaboration with universities and medical training institutions, women in politics and governance, from symbolic representation to transformative leadership. Despite producing Africa's first elected female president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Liberia has not significantly advanced the political inclusion of women. Today, women hold less than 12% of parliamentary seats and a similarly small percentage in ministerial roles. Although the Boakai administration includes a few female cabinet members, their influence within the broader decision making architecture remains limited. The Gender and Development Ministry has proposed several reforms, including a gender quota bill requiring political parties to field at least 30% female candidates. However, the bill remains stalled in the legislature due to a lack of political will and opposition from conservative blocs. Cultural norms, lack of campaign financing, gender based violence, and patriarchal party structures continue to deter women from entering politics. Female aspirants often face smear campaigns, intimidation, and exclusion from internal party decision making processes. In contrast, countries like Senegal, 43% women in parliament, Rwanda, 61%, and South Africa, 46%, have embraced quotas, capacity building, and gender equity policies, resulting in meaningful female leadership across public institutions. President Boakai has an opportunity to honor Liberia's legacy by championing gender inclusion through fast tracking gender legislation with cross party support, funding mentorship programs for young female leaders, making campaign finance accessible for women and marginalized groups, enforcing gender parity in presidential appointments and civil service recruitment. Without these reforms, Liberia risks maintaining a tokenistic approach to gender, celebrating past milestones while failing to create a truly inclusive future. A midterm review of the Boakai administration, governance scorecard, and public sentiment. As President Joseph Boakai's government approaches the midpoint of its first term, it becomes imperative to assess its performance through the lens of governance delivery, economic management, public confidence, and institutional reforms. While the administration came into office on a wave of high expectations, riding on the slogan of rescuing Liberia, many Liberians now find themselves asking a sobering question. Are we better off today than we were in 2023? From a governance standpoint, the Boakai administration has demonstrated greater rhetorical commitment to transparency, anti corruption, and public sector reform. However, implementation remains sluggish and, in some instances, contradictory. Cabinet reshuffles, delayed audits, and a slow pace of legislative reform have dampened the early optimism that greeted the Unity Party's return to power. The much publicized pledge to depoliticize public institutions and ensure merit based appointments has not fully materialized. Reports from the Center for Policy Action and Accountability, CPAA, indicate that political patronage and loyalty based appointments remain widespread, particularly in state owned enterprises and revenue generating agencies. Moreover, President Boakai's administration has struggled with legislative coordination. A divided and occasionally obstructionist legislature, still heavily influenced by opposition CDC aligned lawmakers, has slowed down or diluted key reform bills. The lack of robust cross party consensus has paralyzed bills related to decentralization, electoral reform, and public finance transparency. Public satisfaction is mixed. According to a 2025 Afrobarometer survey, only 38% of Liberians believe the country is moving in the right direction, down from 52% in early 2024. Rising cost of living, limited job opportunities, and perceived government inaction on corruption remain the most frequently cited concerns. To change this trajectory, the administration must establish clear timelines and metrics for its development promises, accelerate delivery on infrastructure, jobs, and healthcare access, institutionalize quarterly citizen scorecards to measure government responsiveness, rebuild trust through proactive engagement with civil society, media, and traditional leaders. Liberia's role in ECOWAS and regional diplomacy, from stability, beneficiary to stability contributor. For decades, Liberia was a recipient of regional solidarity, from the ECOWAS peacekeeping forces during the Civil War to post-war election monitoring and economic support. Today, under President Boakai, there is an opportunity for Liberia to pivot from a beneficiary of stability to a contributor to regional peace and integration. The West African region faces renewed threats from unconstitutional power grabs, terrorism in the Sahel, economic shocks, and mass migration. Liberia, while relatively stable, risks becoming geopolitically irrelevant if it does not step up its regional diplomacy. President Boakai's recent attendance at the ECOWAS Heads of State Summit in Abuja was a positive sign. His endorsement of a joint ECOWAS security mechanism and proposal for an anti-corruption observatory were well received. However, Liberia must match these diplomatic overtures with domestic reforms and a consistent foreign policy posture. At present, Liberia's missions abroad remain underfunded, poorly staffed, and occasionally embroiled in scandals. Diplomatic outreach to neighbors like Guinea and Cote d'Ivoire, countries with deep historical and economic ties to Liberia, remains limited in scope and vision. In comparison, Ghana, Senegal, and Nigeria have taken the lead in shaping ECOWAS positions, mediating regional disputes, and driving the African Continental Free Trade Area AFCFTA agenda. Liberia must enhance its diplomatic capacity by establishing a regional affairs desk within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, professionalizing diplomatic appointments and reducing political interference, engaging in trilateral development initiatives with neighboring countries, hosting periodic ECOWAS forums to position Monrovia as a hub for peace diplomacy, youth unemployment and the need for social innovation, a crisis and an opportunity. Liberia's youth population, vibrant, restless, and underemployed, represents both the country's greatest asset and its greatest vulnerability. With over 65% of the population under the age of 35, youth unemployment remains one of the most pressing national challenges. Despite campaign promises and donor-funded projects, job creation under the Boakai administration has been minimal and heavily urban-centered. The Ministry of Youth and Sports, which should serve as the engine for youth empowerment, continues to suffer from weak coordination, limited funding, and insufficient program delivery. Most national youth service programs lack scale, monitoring mechanisms, and sustainable funding. Meanwhile, private sector job creation remains sluggish due to investment barriers, electricity costs, and weak industrial policy. However, the emergence of social innovation and entrepreneurship presents an untapped solution. Across Africa, youth-led startups in agriculture, green energy, fintech, and digital services are creating jobs and solving social problems simultaneously. In Kenya, government-backed innovation hubs such as iHub Nairobi are catalyzing a new tech ecosystem. In Rwanda, government grants and tax incentives are fueling youth-led agribusinesses and clean energy projects. Liberia can replicate these models by establishing a national innovation fund dedicated to youth enterprises, creating county-level incubation hubs that provide skills training and seed capital, incentivizing private sector collaboration through public-private youth employment schemes, institutionalizing entrepreneurship education across all secondary and tertiary institutions. Without bold steps, Liberia risks a social explosion as frustration grows among jobless youth increasingly drawn to crime, migration, or political extremism. Bridging the urban-rural divide, infrastructure, education, and inclusion. Liberia's development landscape remains starkly divided between Monrovia and the rest of the country. While the capital has seen modest growth in roads, banking services, and mobile connectivity, rural areas remain trapped in a cycle of neglect, poverty, and underdevelopment. Counties like River Cess, Barpolu and Grand Cru still lack paved roads, basic schools, functioning clinics, and electricity. The promise of county service centers, once hailed as the cornerstone of decentralization, has faded, with many now inoperable due to resource constraints and poor management. This urban rural imbalance not only deepens inequality, but also fuels internal migration, overcrowding cities and straining public services. Bridging the gap requires a rural transformation strategy anchored in rural road construction, linking farms to markets and clinics to communities, expansion of community based schools with digital learning tools, decentralized energy systems using solar mini grids, incentives for civil servants, especially teachers and health workers, to serve in remote areas. Ethiopia's One Wareda, One Product model, and South Africa's Integrated Rural Development Program provide regional templates Liberia can adapt. The long term stability and economic growth of Liberia will depend on making rural areas livable, productive, and fully integrated into the national economy. Liberia's judiciary, under the Boakai administration, is justice still delayed and denied? A functioning, independent, and accessible judiciary is one of the core pillars of any democratic society. In Liberia, however, the judicial system has long been plagued by inefficiency, underfunding, politicization, and lack of public trust. 18 months into President Boakai's administration, promises to strengthen the rule of law and ensure judicial reform remain largely rhetorical. Courtrooms in rural counties continue to operate with skeletal staff, poorly maintained infrastructure, and long case backlogs. In some jurisdictions, there are no resident magistrates, leaving citizens without access to justice for months. In others, traditional leaders still adjudicate land disputes, domestic violence cases, and inheritance issues, often with no legal training and no appeal mechanisms. The judiciary branch of government, led by the Chief Justice and the Supreme Court, has been widely perceived as conservative and status quo oriented. Attempts to increase transparency, such as publishing judgments online or opening judicial proceedings to the media, have made limited progress. Most citizens still view the courts as elite driven and out of reach for the average person. Allegations of justice for sale, wherein favorable rulings are secured through bribes, remain common. A report by the Liberia Justice Sector Working Group, LJSWG, in early 2025 found that nearly 70% of respondents believe the judiciary is influenced by money or politics. President Boakai has not yet made sweeping judicial appointments or pushed for constitutional amendments to strengthen judicial independence. The Judicial Service Commission, which is supposed to ensure merit-based appointments, remains dormant. Similarly, the Magistrate Sitting Program, a key initiative to increase court presence in rural areas, has stalled due to lack of funding. Comparatively, Kenya's Judicial Service Commission and South Africa's Office of the Public Protector offer models of judicial transparency and accountability. Liberia could also benefit from establishing fast-track commercial courts to address business-related disputes and attract investment. Funding mobile court units in remote areas to deliver justice closer to citizens, mandating annual public performance reviews of judges and courts, integrating traditional justice into formal structures through training, certification, and oversight. Without robust reform, the judiciary risks becoming a bottleneck in the very rescue mission that the Boakai administration promised. Reimagining Liberia's education system, building human capital for the 21st century Liberia's education sector remains in crisis. From dilapidated classrooms to underpaid teachers, outdated curricula, and alarming dropout rates, especially among girls, the system is struggling to deliver even the most basic quality of learning. Yet, education is arguably Liberia's best long-term investment in stability, growth, and innovation. President Boakai campaigned on revitalizing education, and to his credit, school fees in public primary schools have been eliminated and teacher recruitment has resumed. However, deeper, system wide reforms are yet to be enacted. The Ministry of Education's 2025 annual sector review revealed that only 36% of grade 6 students pass literacy and numeracy benchmarks. Student to teacher ratios in rural counties remain as high as 60.1. Over 45% of schools lack clean drinking water or sanitation facilities. Curricula remain heavily theory based, with little emphasis on digital literacy, critical thinking, or vocational skills. Meanwhile, private schools, often unaffordable to the poor, continue to outperform public institutions, creating a two-tier system of educational inequality. In the face of the fourth industrial revolution, Liberia risks falling further behind unless urgent reforms are made. Forward-looking actions should include curriculum reform to prioritize science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, STEAM, nationwide teacher certification programs and digital teaching aids, expansion of technical and vocational education training, TVET, in all counties, partnership with telecom companies to provide digital learning platforms and solar-powered tablets in remote areas. Countries like Ghana, Mauritius, and Rwanda have invested significantly in digital classrooms and skills-based education. Liberia, with its young population, cannot afford to delay this transformation. Tackling climate adaptation and environmental resilience, a silent emergency. Liberia's environmental challenges, coastal erosion, deforestation, waste management, and erratic rainfall are escalating, yet they rarely feature at the top of the political agenda. Climate change is not just a distant threat, it is already impacting agriculture, displacing communities, and undermining health and livelihoods. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and the Forestry Development Authority, FDA, though active, are chronically under-resourced and lack the enforcement capacity to tackle illegal mining, logging, and pollution. The Monrovia City Corporation, MCC, struggles to manage waste, and open defecation remains widespread in some urban and peri-urban areas. Sea level rise continues to eat away at low-lying coastal communities. West Point, New Crewtown, and Robertsport face seasonal flooding that damages homes, schools, and livelihoods. Yet Liberia lacks a national climate resilience plan with dedicated funding, risk mapping, and disaster response systems. Liberia's forests, part of the Upper Guinea biodiversity hotspot, are being lost at alarming rates, despite commitments to REDD+, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. Communities near logging concessions frequently complain of being excluded from benefit-sharing agreements, while environmental impact assessments, EIAs, are often bypassed or falsified. To combat this, the Boakai administration must develop a national climate adaptation strategy with multi-sectoral input, invest in urban greening, flood defenses, and plastic recycling initiatives, empower local governments to lead in community-based climate action, partner with ECOWAS and the AU to access climate finance from the Green Climate Fund and similar sources. Liberia's future is inextricably tied to its environment. Ignoring this silent emergency risks eroding every other development gain. The future of democratic consolidation in Liberia, beyond strong men toward strong institutions. Liberia's democracy has been tested time and again, from civil war to fragile peace, from transitional governments to multi-party elections. While the country has made significant strides in stabilizing its democratic processes, its institutions remain vulnerable to elite manipulation, politicization, and executive overreach. As the 2029 election cycle approaches, the question remains, can Liberia finally shift from personality-driven politics to institutional resilience? Under President Boakai's administration, there have been some efforts to restore public trust in democratic norms. The National Elections Commission, NEC, reconstituted in 2024, has begun early consultations on electoral reforms and intends to pilot biometric voter verification systems. However, skepticism remains high due to past logistical failures, delayed vote counts, and allegations of bias. Moreover, political parties themselves have not matured into issue-based institutions. Internal democracy is weak, with most parties, whether ruling or opposition, functioning as vehicles for personal ambition rather than ideological or policy-driven engagement. The Unity Party, CDC, and several newer formations lack transparent financing, gender inclusivity, and consistent youth engagement platforms. Liberia's integrity institutions, including the Liberia Anti-Corruption Commission, LACC, the Public Procurement and Concessions Commission, PPCC, and the Auditor General's Office, require far greater independence and enforcement authority. These institutions must be insulated from political reprisals and empowered to audit all branches of government without fear or favor. The role of the judiciary, as earlier discussed, is central to institutional integrity. But beyond judicial independence, Liberia also needs a reformed legislature with robust oversight capacity and nonpartisan parliamentary committees. Comprehensive political party laws regulating campaign finance, party primaries, and intra-party democracy. Civic education programs that go beyond voting to promote long-term democratic culture. Constitutional clarity on succession, tenure limits, and separation of powers. Examples from Ghana and Botswana show that democratic consolidation is not only about holding elections, it's about creating a culture where rules matter more than rulers. Liberia is not there yet, but it has the foundation. The challenge now is institutionalizing it. The role of traditional media and citizen journalism, building accountability or spreading disinformation. In Liberia's dynamic political ecosystem, media continues to play a double-edged role. On one hand, traditional radio and newspapers remain the most trusted sources of information, especially in rural areas. On the other hand, the rise of citizen journalism and social media platforms has introduced new complexities, balancing the power of real-time reporting with the dangers of misinformation. Radio stations such as ELBC, Truth FM, OKFM, and Fabric Radio have maintained a relatively high level of credibility, often hosting public affairs programs, debates, and investigative journalism. However, government advertising is often allocated based on political loyalty, undermining the financial independence of some outlets. Meanwhile, the emergence of Facebook Live shows, WhatsApp news groups, and YouTube-based influencers has transformed how Liberians consume and share news. These platforms have become tools of empowerment, amplifying community voices, exposing corruption, and broadcasting citizen grievances in real time. But they have also become vectors of disinformation, fake news, and unverified political propaganda. In early 2025, several viral videos misreported ethnic clashes in Nimba County, triggering panic and displacement, only for the Ministry of Information to later clarify the events were exaggerated. This and other incidents underscore the urgent need for media literacy campaigns, robust fact-checking platforms, and ethical standards for online content creators. The Boakai administration has proposed a digital media regulation framework, but civil society groups fear it could lead to censorship or politically motivated crackdowns. A better approach would be supporting independent fact-checking institutions like the Daily Talk Fact Lab, providing training for citizen journalists on ethical reporting and verification techniques, funding community-based media to decentralize information flow, enacting laws that protect journalists while penalizing coordinated disinformation campaigns, not individual criticism of public figures. The media landscape will play a defining role in Liberia's democratic future. The question is whether the space will remain open, pluralistic, and responsibly managed, or become a new frontier for manipulation and misinformation. Land tenure and agricultural reform, unlocking Liberia's economic backbone. Liberia's economy is still heavily agrarian, with nearly 70% of the population engaged in subsistence farming. Yet, agriculture contributes less than 30% to GDP, largely due to low productivity, weak land rights, and lack of investment in agro-processing. At the center of this underperformance is a complex and often chaotic land tenure system, where formal and customary claims often overlap, leading to disputes, land grabs, and investor hesitation. The establishment of the Liberia Land Authority, LLA, was a step forward, but implementation has lagged. There is still no fully digitized land registry, and thousands of rural Liberians have no formal title to the land their families have farmed for generations. This makes them vulnerable to eviction, manipulation, and disenfranchisement when major concessions are issued for logging, mining, or agribusiness. President Boakai has acknowledged the need for land reform, but so far, there has been little movement beyond pilot programs in Bong and Lofa counties. Community land rights acts have not been scaled nationally, and public awareness remains low. Meanwhile, youth continue to migrate from villages to cities in search of jobs that agriculture could offer if made viable. Liberia's potential in cocoa, oil palm, rice, cassava, and horticulture is immense. But to unleash it, the country must fully implement the Land Rights Act 2018 with community education and titling programs, offer agricultural grants and inputs to youth cooperatives and female farmers, encourage agro-processing by eliminating import taxes on equipment and linking farmers to markets, reform the Ministry of Agriculture to function as a service provider, not just a bureaucracy. Countries like Ivory Coast and Ethiopia have shown how clear land tenure, modern farming techniques, and government private collaboration can revolutionize the agricultural sector. For Liberia, land reform is not just about property, it's about food security, jobs, peace, and economic diversification. The 2029 political horizon, continuity or change on the Liberian front. As Liberia moves steadily toward the 2029 general elections, the political landscape is already showing signs of early maneuvering, shifting alliances, and quiet succession planning. President Boakai has yet to declare whether he will seek re-election, a decision that carries immense weight not only for the Unity Party, but also for Liberia's democratic maturity. At 84 years old by the next election, Boakai will have to weigh legacy over longevity. If he chooses to step aside, the ruling party must present a credible, visionary successor capable of maintaining continuity while re-energizing national reforms. If he chooses to run again, the electorate will demand clear progress and measurable delivery, not campaign promises. On the opposition front, the Coalition for Democratic Change, CDC, remains a formidable force, with George Weah maintaining influence despite his electoral loss. However, a new wave of independent candidates and alternative parties, particularly those driven by youth and technocratic platforms, are beginning to emerge. Their success will depend on access to campaign financing, media coverage, and grassroots mobilization. The next 4 years will determine whether Liberia deepens its democratic culture or falls back into personalized winner-takes-all politics. Critical to this will be electoral reform ensuring biometric voter registration, transparent result transmission, and diaspora voting, peaceful political engagement with zero tolerance for hate speech or incitement, a robust role for the National Elections Commission, NEC, civil society, media, and regional observers in maintaining electoral integrity. Post pandemic economic recovery, inclusive growth, or repackaged elitism. Liberia's post-COVID-19 economic recovery has been fragile and uneven. While macroeconomic indicators, such as inflation control and currency stabilization, have shown modest improvement, these gains have not trickled down to the everyday lives of Liberians. Youth unemployment, rising food prices, and stagnant wages continue to shape public frustration. Informal sector workers, smallholder farmers, and women led businesses remain largely excluded from government stimulus programs and formal financial services. Donor funded projects and extractive sector investments have spurred short term growth, but without a comprehensive industrial policy, job creation and value addition remain limited. To make recovery inclusive, the Boakai administration and successive governments must build a national social protection system for the poorest households, expand infrastructure investment in roads, energy, and ICT with a pro-poor focus, incentivize local content policies across industries to retain value within Liberia, facilitate public-private partnerships that prioritize local job creation and skills transfer, national identity and cultural revival, healing a fragmented nation. Liberia's national identity remains fragile, shaped by historical tensions between settler and indigenous populations, amplified by war and fragmented by regionalism and tribalism. Yet amid these divisions, there are also shared aspirations, shared sacrifices, and a rich cultural heritage that could serve as a unifying force. The lack of a national civic identity, taught and lived, continues to undermine unity and deepen distrust. Many young Liberians, born after the war, have never learned the full story of their country's struggle or participated in civic processes that promote inclusiveness and patriotism. A national identity revival should not be romanticized. It must be intentional and institutionalized. This includes national civic education campaigns and history curriculum reforms, investment in arts, music, and national festivals that promote unity and diversity, community dialogues, truth-telling platforms, and reconciliation initiatives to address lingering post-conflict trauma. In Rwanda, national unity is promoted through umuganda, community service, storytelling, and shared rituals. In Ghana, public holidays like Founders Day are used to revisit national values. Liberia has the tools. It now needs the leadership and will to weave a common national tapestry. The role of development partners, supporting sovereignty, not substitution. International partners, multilateral donors, NGOs, and bilateral allies have played a pivotal role in Liberia's recovery journey. Yet too often, they have also substituted for state functions, undermined local institutions, or advanced donor priorities over community needs. As 2029 approaches, development partners must shift towards sustainable partnership models that strengthen Liberia's capacity to lead its own development. This includes funding institution building, not just service delivery, supporting policy dialogue spaces that include local government, youth, and civil society, prioritizing capacity transfer over expatriate-heavy implementation models, ensuring transparency and accountability in donor-funded programs. Liberians deserve a future where external support complements, not replaces, their own ingenuity, leadership, and resilience. Final reflections and advice to African leaders. Liberia's story is not unique. Across Africa, countries are grappling with the same triple burden: weak institutions, unmet development expectations, and the widening gap between leaders and the people. But Liberia also represents something powerful, a nation that has fallen, risen, and still stands, with an opportunity to chart a new path. To African leaders, the lessons from Liberia are clear: build institutions, not dynasties. Charisma and personal popularity cannot replace strong systems. Invest in electoral commissions, courts, parliaments, and anti corruption agencies with real independence. Listen to your people. Engage citizens beyond election seasons. Create feedback mechanisms, town halls, and policy platforms where people feel heard and respected. Prioritize youth and innovation. Africa's demographic dividend will either be our downfall or our greatest asset. Equip the next generation with tools, skills, and trust. Lead with humility and accountability. Public office is service, not entitlement. When you make mistakes, admit them. When you succeed, share the credit. When your time is up, leave honorably. Invest in national unity. Celebrate diversity. Confront historical injustices. Promote a national identity that transcends tribe, religion, or region. Summary of key messages. The Boakai administration has shown political maturity but faces criticism for slow reforms, growing public frustration, and weak delivery on key promises. Liberia's institutions, judiciary, legislature, civil service, media, must be reformed and empowered to outlive personalities. Critical sectors like education, agriculture, justice, and climate resilience require strategic investment and political will. Liberia's youth represent a ticking time bomb or a transformative force, depending on policy choices. The country stands at a crossroads ahead of 2029. It can either consolidate democracy and development or relapse into disappointment and dysfunction. Liberia's story is a cautionary tale and an opportunity for African leaders committed to building a future worthy of their people. Thank you for watching The Bold African Voice, BAV, your hub for critical analysis, courageous storytelling, and unapologetically African perspectives. If today's discussion sparked your thoughts, drop a comment below. What do you think about Liberia's direction? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay informed. Click the notification bell so you never miss a video. Together we hold the mic. Together we make the difference. This is the Bold African Voice, BAV. See you in the next one.